Officer Ray Dunning walked with confidence, the kind that came from years of wearing a badge. He had been a police officer for more than 15 years and believed that his word was law. He had made a reputation for himself, strict, unshaken, and always in control. Some people respected him, but many feared him. He didn't mind. To him, fear was just another form of respect. Ray had been in trouble before, but nothing ever stuck. Complaints came and went, but his record stayed clean. He knew how to navigate the system, how to cover his tracks, and how to ensure that no real consequences ever came his way. He had friends in the right places, people who believed he was just doing his job. So when he was called to court that day, he wasn't worried. It wasn't his first time, and he was sure it wouldn't be his last. As he walked into the courthouse, he barely paid attention to the people around him. He had other things on his mind. His case was just another formality, something that would pass like all the others. He didn't even think about the judge or who would be presiding over the case. Judges were just people in robes, and as far as he was concerned, they were no different from anyone else. Ray arrived early, so he leaned against a pillar in the hallway, pulled out a cigarette, and lit it. Smoking wasn't allowed inside the courthouse, but that never stopped him before. Rules like that were meant for other people, not him. He took a long drag and exhaled slowly, watching people walk past. Some glanced at him but said nothing. Others walked a little faster as they passed. That was how he liked it, people knowing to stay out of his way. Then, a woman walked by and stopped. She was well-dressed, carrying a briefcase, and had an air of quiet confidence. She looked at him, then at the cigarette, and said, "There's no smoking in here." Her voice was calm, polite, but firm. Ray barely looked at her. "Mind your own business," he muttered, taking another drag. But she didn't walk away. She stood there for a moment, as if expecting him to listen. That annoyed him. He had no patience for people who thought they could tell him what to do. He flicked his cigarette, letting the ashes fall near her feet. She didn't react the way he expected. She didn't back away. She didn't look scared. She just gave him a long, unreadable stare before turning and walking away. Something about her expression unsettled him, but he pushed the thought aside. A few minutes later, a voice called out that the courtroom was ready. Ray took one last drag before tossing the cigarette aside and walking in. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in a way he never could have imagined. Judge Angela Carter sat in her office, preparing for the case ahead. She was known for being fair but firm, never allowing emotions to cloud her judgment. She had worked hard to reach this position, overcoming obstacles that many wouldn't even believe. But today, something unusual had happened before she even stepped into the courtroom. A man in the hallway had acted rudely toward her, dismissing her words as if she didn't matter. He didn't recognize her, of course. He had no idea that she was the very judge who would be handling his case. Angela wasn't surprised. She had dealt with people like him before, people who assumed things about her without knowing anything about who she really was. She glanced at the papers in front of her. Officer Ray Dunning. A name she hadn't heard in years, but one she could never forget. Her fingers brushed against the faint scar on her cheek, a mark left behind from an incident long ago. She remembered it clearly, the fear, the pain, and most of all, the feeling of helplessness. She had been much younger then, and Ray had been an officer even back in those days. Back then, he had treated her unfairly, using his authority in ways that no one should. She had tried to speak up, but no one had listened. He had walked away without consequences, while she was left carrying the memory of that day forever. But life had a way of bringing things full circle. Today, she was no longer the young woman who had no power. Today, she was the judge, and he was the one standing trial. Angela took a deep breath. She had spent her entire career proving that justice should be blind, not influenced by personal feelings or past experiences. This case would be no different. She would listen to the evidence, examine the facts, and make a fair decision. That was her duty, and she would not let anything change that. But deep inside, She couldn't ignore the irony of the situation. Ray had walked into the courthouse, acting as if he was untouchable, completely unaware of who he had just disrespected. He had no idea that the person he had treated so rudely was about to decide his fate. She stood up and adjusted her robe. It was time to enter the courtroom. No matter what had happened in the past, she would handle this case with the same professionalism she always did. But one thing was certain: Ray Dunning was about to learn that the world had changed, and this time, he wouldn't be able to walk away so easily. As she stepped into the courtroom, she saw him standing near the defense table, still looking confident, still believing he was in control. Angela took her seat and looked directly at him. For the first time, Ray met her eyes, and in that instant, his expression changed. Recognition flickered across his face. He knew. And for the first time in a long time, Officer Ray Dunning looked nervous. Ray Dunning sat at the defense table, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He had walked into the courtroom with the same confidence he always carried. But now, something felt different. His mind replayed the moment in the hallway. The woman he had ignored, the one he had spoken to without a second thought. Now she was sitting in the judge's chair, looking right at him. He clenched his jaw. How was this possible? Of all the judges in the courthouse, why did it have to be her? His heartbeat quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe she wouldn't make a big deal out of what had happened outside. Maybe she would focus only on the case and ignore everything else. Judge Angela Carter looked over the case file in front of her, her face unreadable. She had been in this position countless times before, hearing cases, weighing evidence, and delivering justice. But this was different, not because of her past with Ray, but because of what had just happened before they stepped into the courtroom. Angela was not someone who acted out of anger, nor did she let emotions cloud her judgment. But she believed in something deeply: respect for the law and respect for people. And today, Ray had shown neither. She took a deep breath and addressed the courtroom. "This case involves multiple complaints of excessive force," she said, her voice steady. "Officer Dunning, you are facing serious accusations. I expect full honesty and cooperation during these proceedings." Ray nodded quickly, his usual arrogance fading. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice quieter than before. The prosecution began presenting its case, showing videos, testimonies, and reports from people who had filed complaints against him. Each piece of evidence chipped away at his confidence. The courtroom watched as recordings played, scenes of him using unnecessary force, of him acting without cause, of him treating people unfairly. Angela listened carefully, not allowing herself to react emotionally. But inside, she knew the truth. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern. And now he was finally being held accountable. As the prosecution continued, Angela glanced at Ray. He was no longer leaning back in his chair or looking smug. He sat still, his hands clasped together, his eyes darting around the room. He wasn't used to being in this position, answering for his actions instead of excusing them. When the prosecution finished, Angela turned her gaze toward him. "Officer Dunning," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you have heard the evidence against you. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ray hesitated. He had spoken in court many times before, but always as an officer, always as the one with power. This time, he was just another defendant, and for the first time, he realized there was no easy way out. Ray Dunning swallowed hard. The courtroom was silent, waiting for his response. He had always been in control, always the one asking the questions, demanding answers. But today, everything was different. He wasn't the officer in charge. He was the one being judged. And the person sitting behind the bench was the last person he ever expected to see in power. He cleared his throat and sat up straighter. "Your Honor," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I've always done my duty as a police officer. I never intended to harm anyone. I only acted in situations where I believed force was necessary." Judge Angela Carter didn't react right away. She studied him, her expression unreadable. "Necessary?" she repeated. Officer Dunning, multiple reports show a pattern of excessive force. Videos have captured your actions. Witnesses have testified against you. Are you saying all of them are wrong? Ray hesitated. He had been in court many times before, but never like this. He was used to people defending him, making excuses on his behalf. But today, no one was coming to his rescue. Before he could answer, the prosecutor spoke. Your Honor, the defendant's record speaks for itself. He has received numerous complaints over the years, yet he has faced no real consequences. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a repeated abuse of power. Angela nodded, flipping through the case file. Every page was filled with reports of past incidents. Some had been dismissed. Others had been buried in paperwork. But together, they painted a clear picture. Ray Dunning was not just a tough officer. He had crossed the line too many times. She looked up. Officer Dunning, before I decide your sentence, I want to address something that happened today. Ray's stomach tightened. He knew what was coming. Angela continued, her voice calm but firm. Before this hearing, you ignored a courthouse rule and chose to act disrespectfully towards someone who simply reminded you of it. Without even knowing who I was, you dismissed me. You treated me as if my words had no value. And worse, you acted in a way that showed complete disregard for others. The courtroom was completely silent. The realization was hitting Ray all at once. Angela leaned forward slightly. Do you understand the irony of this situation? You have spent years using your authority to control others. But today, you are in a position where you have no control. Today, the law is holding you accountable. Ray's face felt hot. He could feel everyone's eyes on him. He had always believed he was untouchable. But now, he was trapped in a system he thought he controlled. Angela took a deep breath. I will announce my decision soon. Until then, I suggest you reflect on the choices that brought you here. Ray lowered his eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Powerless. Ray Dunning sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clasped together. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had walked into this courtroom thinking he would leave the same way he always had, untouched, free, and still in control. But now he wasn't so sure. Judge Angela Carter's words kept echoing in his mind. She had spoken with a calm authority, one that couldn't be challenged. He had spent years believing the law was always on his side, that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. But today, the law wasn't protecting him. It was staring him in the face, demanding answers. The prosecution stood up again. Your Honor, before you make your decision, I would like to emphasize something important. Officer Dunning has repeatedly shown that he believes himself to be above the law. Even today, before entering this courtroom, he acted with the same arrogance that has defined his career. Angela nodded. Noted. Officer Dunning, do you have anything else to say for yourself before I move forward? Ray hesitated. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but for the first time, words didn't come easily. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble, but now it felt like every excuse had already been heard before. Finally, he spoke. I never meant to hurt anyone, he said, his voice quieter than before. I was just doing my job the way I was trained to. Angela studied him for a long moment. Doing your job should never mean mistreating people. It should never mean acting without responsibility. And it certainly shouldn't mean ignoring the very laws you swore to uphold. Ray swallowed hard. He could feel the walls closing in. Angela continued, her voice steady but firm. The law is supposed to be fair. It is supposed to serve everyone equally. But for years, you have used it as a shield to protect yourself while harming others. That ends today. The courtroom was silent. Every person in the room was waiting for her decision. Angela looked at the case files once more before setting them down. I will be delivering my sentence soon. But before that, I want you to think about something. Imagine if the roles were reversed. Imagine if you were the one being treated unfairly, if someone with power decided your fate without care or respect. Would you still call it justice? Ray didn't answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't have one. Angela let the silence linger before speaking again. You will soon understand what it means to be held accountable. Ray shifted uncomfortably. He had always believed he was untouchable. But today, he was learning the hardest lesson of all. No one is above the law, not even him. Ray Dunning sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy, pressing against him like an invisible weight. For years, he had been the one in control, the one who decided how things played out. Now he was at the mercy of someone else, someone he had disrespected without even realizing it. Judge Angela Carter glanced at the papers in front of her, but she already knew what she was going to do. This case was about more than just one officer. It was about accountability, about proving that no one was above the law. But before she gave her final ruling, she wanted to give Ray one last chance. "Officer Dunning," she said, her voice steady, "you have been given an opportunity to explain yourself, to show remorse, to take responsibility for your actions. And yet, all I've heard are excuses." Ray's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew she was right. Every time he had been questioned about his actions in the past, he had found a way to shift the blame, to make it seem like he was just following orders, just doing his job. But this time, those excuses weren't working. Angela leaned forward slightly. "Do you truly believe that your actions were justified? That the people who came forward against you were all wrong?" Ray swallowed. His entire career, he had convinced himself that what he did was necessary, that the complaints were just from people who didn't understand the job. But now, sitting here, facing a judge who wasn't afraid to hold him accountable, he wasn't so sure anymore. He hesitated, then finally spoke. I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. Angela raised an eyebrow. It was the first honest thing he had said all day. "You don't know," she repeated. "For years, you acted without hesitation, without doubt. But now that you're the one facing judgment, suddenly you're unsure." Ray didn't answer. Angela exhaled, then turned to the courtroom. "The law must be fair. It must be applied equally to everyone, no matter their status, no matter their position." Officer Dunning believed he was above the law, but today that belief ends. She looked back at him. "Before I deliver my sentence, I want you to think about everything that led you here. Think about the people who feared you, not because you were protecting them, but because you abused your power. Think about the choices you made, the moments when you could have done better, but didn't." Ray lowered his gaze. The weight of her words settled in his chest. Angela's voice remained firm. "Justice is not about revenge. It is about fairness. And today, you will learn what that truly means." Ray sat motionless, realizing that for the first time in his life, there was nothing he could do to escape the consequences of his actions. Ray Dunning sat still, his hands resting on the table, his mind clouded with thoughts. He had walked into the courtroom with confidence, expecting the same outcome he had always known, his badge protecting him, his history shielding him. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was just another defendant, waiting to hear his fate. Judge Angela Carter remained calm as she looked at him. "Officer Dunning," she began, "before I deliver my decision, I want to ask you something. Do you truly understand why you are here today?" Ray hesitated. He wanted to say yes, but something in Angela's expression told him that wouldn't be enough. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing, that his authority gave him power over others. But now, sitting in front of her, with all the evidence laid out before him, he was beginning to see things differently. I made mistakes," he said, his voice lower than before. Angela nodded but remained firm. "Mistakes happen. But what you did was more than just a mistake. It was a repeated pattern of abuse. And for too long, you believed there would be no consequences." Ray clenched his jaw. The truth was uncomfortable, but he couldn't deny it. He had dismissed complaints, ignored warnings, and acted as if the rules didn't apply to him. He had convinced himself that his badge gave him the right to act however he wanted. But today, that illusion was breaking apart. Angela continued, "Justice isn't about punishing you because of who you are. It's about making sure that those who have been harmed by your actions see that the law applies to everyone, including you." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, based on the evidence presented, we request a fair but firm ruling. Officer Dunning's actions were not isolated incidents. They show a clear pattern of misconduct. We believe accountability is necessary to restore trust in the system." Angela nodded. She turned back to Ray. "Do you have anything to say before I deliver my decision?" Ray exhaled slowly. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but he knew there wasn't one. The only thing left to do was face the truth. He looked up at Angela, his voice quieter than before. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought I was doing my job, but I see now that I wasn't always fair. I didn't treat people the way I should have." Angela studied him for a moment, then nodded. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. She looked around the courtroom before speaking her final words. "The law is here to serve everyone, and today, justice will be served." Ray felt his stomach tighten. The moment he had been dreading had arrived. Judge Angela Carter was about to announce his fate. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone held their breath as they waited for Judge Angela Carter to speak. Ray Dunning, the once confident officer, sat motionless. His hands were clenched together, his jaw tight. He had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable, that the system would always protect him. But today, he knew that wasn't true. Angela looked directly at him. "Officer Dunning, the evidence against you is clear. Your actions were not isolated incidents, but a pattern of behavior that has harmed many people. The law is meant to serve and protect everyone, not just those in power." Ray swallowed hard. He already knew what was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. Angela continued, her voice steady. "You have used your position not to protect, but to intimidate. You have ignored the responsibilities that come with your badge. But today, the law is holding you accountable." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Then she spoke again. "I hereby sentence you to suspension from duty, mandatory retraining, and a full review of your past cases. Furthermore, you will face legal consequences for your actions, as no one is above the law. The court will ensure that justice is served for those who have been affected." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some people nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, processing the moment. Ray exhaled slowly. He had expected the worst, yet the reality of losing his position, his authority, his control, still felt like a heavy blow. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one making the decisions. He wasn't the one with power. Angela leaned forward slightly. "I hope you take this as an opportunity to reflect. You once swore to uphold justice, and now you have the chance to understand what that truly means." Ray didn't respond. He simply gave a slow nod, accepting the consequences. There was no way out of this. His past had finally caught up to him. As the gavel struck, the courtroom began to empty. People whispered among themselves, some glancing at Ray as they left. He remained in his seat, staring down at the table, his mind filled with thoughts. Angela stood up and gathered her papers. Before leaving, she glanced at him one last time. "The law is not about power, Officer Dunning. It's about fairness. Remember that." With that, she walked away. Ray sat there for a long time. The courtroom, once full, was now empty. He had always believed that justice was something he controlled, but today he had learned a hard truth. Justice wasn't about control. It was about accountability. And no one, not even him, was above it.